I'm Mike Schachter, president of the Carolina Nature Coalition. Our mission is to raise public awareness of environmental and environmental justice issues and to encourage citizens in meaningful community action. The co-host today is the Craven County branch of the North Carolina NAACP, for which I am also the vice president. And it has the mission to achieve equality, political rights, and social inclusion by advancing policies and practices that can expand human and civil rights, eliminate discrimination, and accelerate the well-being, education, and economic security of Black people and all people of color. And the presentation today will surely meet these missions. Many of our members will be on Zoom today, some because of concerns about COVID, and others because they're a long distance away and don't want to drive at night. I want to thank the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of New Bern for providing this wonderful venue and technical assistance, especially Tom Shoup, who is also our CNC secretary, and also Connie Casey, who baked the brownies and works as to create the publicity and for the event, and is our communications director. I believe that I first met William J. Barber III and some of his siblings at an NAACP state conference when they were in the youth and college division, and their father was the president. I know that I met William when Vice President and almost President Al Gore spoke at the Greenleaf Church in Goldsboro. More recently, I heard William speak at a North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality and at the Environmental Justice Advisory Meeting. And this summer, for Juneteenth, on a podcast hosted by our friend Talina Massey. William Butler III has a wonderful North Carolina education with a degree in environmental physics from the North Carolina Central University and a degree in environmental and energy law and policy from the UNC School of Law. He will definitely be talking about the current activities as CEO of the Rural Beacon Initiative and answer questions after this presentation. And now, our presenter, William J. Barber III.
Most of this radiation is absorbed by the earth and warms it. Some of that heat is re-radiated into space in the form of infrared radiation. Some of this outgoing infrared radiation is, in a normal scenario, trapped by the atmosphere. And normally that's a good thing because that phenomenon is what has kept the range of temperatures on the Earth in somewhat of a perfect balance in order to have life exist on the planet in our normal spectrum of climate realities. Not too hot, like Venus, not too cold, like our sister planet Mars, but perfect for life to exist. As that atmospheric band gets thicker, more and more and more of that outgoing infrared gets trapped. So what ends up happening is the heat builds up in the atmosphere. Now, this slide starts to get into some of the realities of what causes that band to get thicker. It is the emission of greenhouse gases. A lot of you all, I'm sure, have heard about carbon dioxide. Show of hands. You get a sticker, AK. But there are other greenhouse gases, including methane as well. This slide gets into the reality that one of the main sources of the global warming pollution is by far our use, society's use of fossil fuels. So this represents the combination of your oil, your coal, and your gas. And you can see that after World War II, the use of fossil fuels exploded in a dramatic way, and the release of CO2 into the atmosphere also began to increase dramatically. If you look at the upper right-hand corner, you'll notice that we had 3 years of a plateau. It's debate is out on why that was the cause. Some say economic downturn, some say increased awareness. But regardless, the levels are going up again now. Getting into some of the stats that these kind of just speak for themselves. CO2 is being released into the atmosphere faster than at any time in at least the last 66 million years. This slide always blows my mind. If you take the accumulated amount of man-made global warming pollution in the atmosphere, that pollution, those greenhouse gases, trap as much extra energy as would be released by exploding 500,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs every 24 hours, every day. So when we see these massive shifts that we're hearing about in terms of Earth's ecosystems, the changing of our climate, it's this level of energy that is being trapped that is affecting our system and affecting it in a very radical way. This slide is simply a bell curve, and what it shows is the distribution of so-called normal temperatures on the Earth, arbitrarily chosen as the period between 1951 and 1980. The blue represents your cooler than average days. The white represent your average temperature days. The red represent your warmer than average days. In the 1980s, the entire data set shifts to the warm side. Also, in the lower right-hand corner, you see the emergence of this darker red color, which represents the first time we see a statistically significant number of what is known as extremely hot days. In the 1990s, the curve again shifts to the warmer side. And then in the last 10 years, it shifts further. And what we see is that the extremely hot days have become significantly more numerous than the cooler than average days. We still have cool days. We even have cold days on the planet. But the preponderance is that we see warmer than average and hotter than average and extremely hot days. In fact, extremely hot days are now almost 150 times more common than they were just 30 years ago. Extreme temperatures used to cover 0.1% of the Earth. Now they cover nearly 15%. And again, we're starting to get into the heaviness of this situation. I warned you all, so bear with me. But I believe that nothing that is not faced can be solved. So we have to understand the reality of where we are if we are actually to get to the hope, to the solutions, to what we can be do. Economic losses from extreme weather have been pretty massive. Over the last 2 years alone, economic losses have totaled over $600 billion. One thing that I do in my work and we do at my Business Rule Beacon Initiative is highlight that in the midst of this reality, it is imperative that frontline communities, Black, brown, coastal, rural communities, communities that have relied on extractive industry, are at the forefront of conversations around solutions. Because the organizer in me believes that the people who are closest to the problem, who are most impacted, are also the people who are closest to the answers to what needs to be done. That is also true when we think about the role, a specific and unique role of the Southeast as a region. In terms of when we look at climate impacts, the South and Midwest are expected to suffer the largest economic losses due to climate change. We also know that out of the top 100 counties that are most impacted by the climate crisis, 97 of those are located in the South. And so there's a unique role that we, communities like us, must play in highlighting the need for that leadership, in understanding how the South has been a crucible of progressive movement to some of the nation's most challenging issues, and also the history of disparity that is pervasive across the South. Everything from racial segregation and injustice to economic poverty to now climate crisis. But being a source of that impact has also led to really powerful responses by communities, by leadership, by fusion coalitions to meet and challenge those realities. When we think about the role of faith in this moment as well, Pope Francis, the Holy Father Francis, in his encyclical letter, Laudato Si, on the care for our common home, said this, that if climate change represents one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day, its worst impact will probably be felt by developing countries in coming decades. Many of the poor live in areas particularly affected by phenomena related to warming, and their means of subsistence are largely dependent on natural reserves and ecosystemic services such as agriculture, fishing, and forestry. They have no other financial activities or resources which can enable them to adapt to climate change or to face natural disasters, and their access to social services and protection is very limited. So when we talk about the climate crisis, this crisis is particularly severe because it serves as a global multiplier on every form of social inequity that we have perfected as a society. And the reason I say perfected is because the disparities that exist that are made worse by climate change have often been the result of intentional bad policy decisions rooted in either racial exclusion or economic isolation and exploitation. To dive a little further in this conversation around faith, you all know what was coming. You know who my father is, so don't act surprised. When we think about some of the doctrine that has led to the exploitation of the planet and this climate crisis, some of it can be traced back to a misinterpretation of some of the charges we see in faith traditions. I won't go into all of them, but in particular, I am a Christian. I identify as a Christian. Not to impose that on anyone, but that is my faith tradition. And in a 1967 essay titled "The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis," the philosopher Lynn White argued that Christianity had unintentionally become an anthropocentric religion, meaning centering solely on humanity as the most important aspect of God's creation. And that could be blamed partially for the ecological crisis. This view of humans having dominion over creation, over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the resources of the planet, instead of stewardship, has often been rooted in a flawed interpretation of the original text. And I mean, we can look at the language. So, in Genesis 1, verse 26 through 28, a lot of the mainstream interpretation reads as thus. Look at the first two paragraphs. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. That is the normal mainstream interpretation. However, recent study has challenged that and recognized that that word dominion is actually a Romanized misinterpretation of the original Hebrew. And the original Hebrew is actually closer to a word that means fill and replenish. So when we look at that language and replace it with the closer version of the original Hebrew, it reads as thus. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill and replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And that distinction is really important because it completely changes the meaning of that passage, which for so many of us have been core to our understanding of how humanity should relate to the planet. In 2015, Pope Francis issued a further encyclical on this and stated that the biblical texts are to be read in their context with an appropriate hermeneutic, recognizing that they tell us to till and keep the world. Tilling refers to cultivating, plowing, or working, while keeping means caring, protecting, overseeing, and preserving. This implies a relationship of mutual responsibility between human beings and nature. The Hebrew word kabash, which is closer in reference to subdue, is only used when one is dealing with a hostile enemy. And that was the Romanized version. On the other hand, the Hebrew word rada is used in the sense meaning that leaders have dominion, they have responsibility, they are charged over their territories and subjects, meaning that they must rule in a way that leads to care, leads in care. Other frameworks that talk about this crisis, and this is more so on the spectrum of solutions. This comes from the Brundtland Report. Anyone? My man, you get a sticker. This came out in 1987, and on the context of sustainable development, said that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I mentioned that we were going to talk a little bit about equity in and environmental climate justice in climate solutions. But I want to do some background and say that recognize that conversation is not a new conversation. It was actually intended to be a part of the original theories of sustainable development. There are three pillars that form the discourse of sustainable development. The three E's, if you will. Economy, defined as solutions that promote economic growth and efficiency. Ecology, defined as solutions and actions that promote environmental protection. And equity, defined as solutions that look at social justice and economic opportunities for communities. When the concept of sustainable development first started coming about, there was a lot of intentional thought put into the first two pillars. What's your name? John, you can attest to this, right? There was a lot of intentional thought put into getting the pillar of economy right, making sure we do things that are good for the dollars. A lot of thought put into getting the pillar of ecology right. How can we do things that preserve our natural resources? But we missed the heart. We missed the equity conversation. We forgot the third pillar. And so even when we look at some of the challenges of the current climate and environmental movement, how there have been these blind spots when we talk about community voices, how there have been these blind spots when we have pitted social equity needs against achieving greenhouse gas emission reduction at any cost. A lot of it has been because we forgot the framework. We forgot the framework. So how do we define equity? Some folks say equity is fairness. I think that's one way to think about it. It's close, but not quite. Say it's equality. It's closer, but not quite. Equity is actually a deep analytical exercise that looks at whether all people have similar rights and opportunities to meet the basic needs to maintain an acceptable quality of life. So equity forces us to take into account historic realities, forces us to take into account systemic discrimination, forces us to think about the distinct and unique breadth, the spectrum of needs for individuals. Equity is separate and distinct from simply inclusion. It's different than just getting people in a space, getting communities in a space. We have to make sure we're equipping communities with the knowledge to fully engage and advocate for their needs, to fully participate in these conversations. It's different than treating everyone the same. Equity is a process and a pathway, not just an outcome. And when we think about equity and sustainability, what we really are starting to talk about is the concept of a just transition. And a just transition is really cool because it's made up of three pillars as well. The three pillars of environmental justice, climate justice, and energy justice. Environmental justice is defined as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, regardless of color, regardless of national origin or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So there's a procedural element when we discuss environmental justice. Climate justice is defined as the remediation of the impacts of climate change on poor people and people of color, and compensation for harms suffered by such communities due to climate change. Key components of a climate justice narrative include that they are people-centered. They frame our movement, not just one that is about saving the trees or the polar bears, though I love trees and polar bears. But it forces us to understand the urgency of this movement is the effect it has on people. People. Our families, our communities, our loved ones. That's the reality of this crisis. Climate justice also includes acknowledgement of disproportionate impacts. Though every one of us in this room and across this planet are affected by the climate crisis, not everyone's affected the same way. We know that because of deep-seated historic harms, there are some communities that have been made more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Black and brown communities, absolutely, and communities like New Bern that have suffered economic disinvestment. So when we think about sea level rise and having the resources to mitigate that, affected Eastern North Carolina. Communities like across the rural southeastern United States that have too often been seen as the dumping grounds for the polluting assets of our society's economy. And it also, climate justice forces us to look at identifying of intersecting oppressions and issues. Meaning that when we talk about climate, when we talk about this movement, it is not isolated from a conversation on racial justice. Climate justice is racial justice. Climate justice is not isolated from a conversation on economic justice. So we need to talk about clean jobs and ownership opportunities for communities that have been harmed. Climate justice is not isolated from a conversation on democratic access and voter protection, because recognize the only way that we get to robust, urgent action on this crisis is through massive public policy, meaning that we have to have the ability to have unencumbered access to the ballot to elect officials who are responsive to our needs. And then the third prong of just transition, energy justice, which is defined as the goal of achieving equity in both the social and economic participation in the energy system, while also remediating social, economic, and health burdens and those historically harmed by the energy system. This is also very much community-centered. It means that it gives us a way to think about climate and the solutions to climate, not just as an environmental issue, but as meeting an immediate human need. Anybody in this room have high utility bills? I'll raise my hand. So when we think about solutions to the climate crisis, what is that? That's energy burden, right? Because rural communities and poor communities are expected to pay more percent of their income to high utility bills, because they often live in underly weatherized homes, older homes. So when we think about solutions to that and saying, oh, we want to deploy clean energy, let's talk about addressing energy burden. We think about clean jobs. Anyone know some young folks who need some jobs in New Bern? Let's think about how do we train communities in these upcoming economic opportunities. The fastest two careers right now in the nation are solar installer. Anyone want to guess the second? What's that? Not quite. What? Who said wind? There you go. Wind turbine technician. So these are incredibly fast-growing fields that offer economic opportunity in a way that really is unprecedented. Now, going back to the special role of the Southeast, I know I talked about it, but I want to make sure we illustrate it. So we do a mapping exercise in our work. And this is simply census data, and it looks at the concentrations of Black, African-American populations on a county level. And notice where the hotspotting is occurring. Notice where the hotspotting is occurring. And if you're a student of sociology, a student of history, you know there are a few names for this region. Anyone? Who's the Bible Belt? Black Belt? There's one more. The Stroke Belt. The Stroke Belt. Because unfortunately, this region has been seen as some of the nation's most egregious cases of public health outcomes. And also just flagging that when we talk about the Black Belt, did you all know that doesn't refer necessarily to the people, that it actually refers to the soil? Because it's been so heavily, it was heavily carbonized. It had this rich, beautiful Black soil throughout the region. So now this data is also census data, but this looks at the percent of the population living in what is known as persistent poverty. And notice again where the hotspottings are occurring. I'll just do a quick. So it's an interesting correlation. Now you see the emergence of some of these areas in the Midwest and the West. And of course, we found that that corresponds to Hispanic and Latino populations as well as indigenous tribal territories. Now this data is less seen in conjunction with these two data sets, which is the frequency of billion-dollar weather disasters for the last 30 years. And notice where the hotspotting is occurring. And so when you run through this, we all know this subconsciously, but seeing it is really just a different exercise. you see that the low-hanging fruit of this climate crisis, the places that are being hit heavily right now, are largely communities of color, largely persistently poor communities, largely communities in the Southeast. So that special place in leadership that I mentioned is illustrated in the data. Now, those of us who are from these communities that are now seen as the front lines know that that's not the only piece of the story, right? You know, these communities are not just destined to be impacted. This goes back to the history of intentionally bad policy decisions that have isolated and pushed out communities into these realities. Take redlining, for example. All of us, most of us, know what redlining was. It was a policy during the New Deal era by which the federal government, in conjunction with efforts to address the national housing shortage at the time, developed a series of maps of every metropolitan area in the country. These maps were color-coded to indicate to banks where it was safe to insure mortgages, areas where it was safe to lend. The government policy had a clear racial disparity, as places that had high populations or were simply adjacent to high populations of blacks or immigrants were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky to insure mortgages. Most of us know that history. Additionally, however, there was a document entitled the Underwriting Manual, which established explicitly segregationist policies as part of its recommendations, saying that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that Black and immigrant communities should not be granted access to the same loans that were helping to increase access to housing for an emerging middle class. And remember that at this time, home ownership was the #1 vehicle through which white Americans actually began to cultivate generational wealth. This had devastating long-term economic effects, including reducing en masse the opportunity for Blacks and immigrants to become homeowners, as well as severely kneecapping the ability to accumulate wealth. And when you look at the current racial wealth in the country, African Americans have only about 5% as compared to white counterparts. And most of that disparity is directly related to the fact that Black and brown families were prohibited by federal housing policy in buying homes. Now, to be clear, this history does not erase the histories of white Americans who were also isolated and locked out of economic policy, but it puts a lens on the effects that bad policy decisions had on specific communities. This is laid out in Richard Rothstein's book, and I highly recommend it, The Color of Law. Now, that history also translates to our current environmental crisis in a number of ways. Number one, the underwriting manual that I mentioned earlier made an additional recommendation that highways would be an effective tool in separating Black and immigrant communities from white neighborhoods. So beginning in the early 1930s, highways were preferentially constructed through, over, and across Black and brown communities across the nation. Entire communities were actually bulldozed for preferred placement of our national highway system. Communities like Freedmanstown in North Dallas, Texas, West Belford in Houston, West Oakland in California. So it furthered the displacement. But not only that, today highways are a significant source of air pollution within communities of color. The same communities that were historically redlined are now disproportionately exposed to vehicular air pollution. According to a recent study, Inequitable Exposure to Air Pollution by the Union of Concerned Scientists, African Americans are exposed to 34% more vehicle air pollution, Latinos are exposed to 26% more, and potentially surprisingly, Asian Americans are exposed to 36% more air pollution. Not only that, the placement of these national highways as our nation's veins of commerce, channels of commerce, also opened the gate to additional community disruption and the beginnings of disproportionate exposures to legacy pollution. So entire communities were bulldozed to place highways. We established that. These highways served as channels of commerce along which big industry, emerging industry sought to develop. And polluting entities looked to places to place their polluting assets in areas that were in the vicinity of these channels of commerce, but also did not have the political or financial capital to offer significant resistance. And because of that history, guess where it was? Happened to be the same communities, poor communities of color, that because they were kneecapped in building economic wealth and shut out of the home ownership process, were now both economically and politically vulnerable en masse. And so a feedback loop of inequity, of exposure to legacy pollution is put in place that still exists today. It's the feedback loop that shows us that 68% of African Americans today live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. It shows us that African Americans are 75% more likely than whites to live in fence-line communities close to oil and gas infrastructure that pollutes our air and changes our climate. It's the reality that in 46 out of 50 US states, people of color live with more air pollution. And at this point, we also see comorbidities begin to take place. Higher and longer exposures to air pollution and lower exposures to green space, because highways and factories and plants, they're not made out of trees and grass, right, though. They're made out of concrete, metal, things that emit chemicals. And when we talk about the context of a global climate crisis, retain heat. So talking about disproportionate exposure to these heat islands. Thereby, we see higher morbidities from asthma, from respiratory disease, deaths from extreme heat. And once again, the feedback loop takes root. Also, because of that widespread lack of access to historic wealth, communities don't necessarily have access to the resources to relocate. Thereby, this phenomenon, this one bad policy decision made over a century ago, becomes the norm generation after generation after generation after generation. And this history is important not for us to just wallow, but to understand two things. Just like these bad policy decisions were made by people, we now have an opportunity to make good policy decisions, to redress those harms. We have that opportunity. Each and every one of us, now that we're aware of this history, can go out and advocate and say that when we talk about climate solutions, we can't just prioritize reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's important, it's crucial, absolutely. But we also have to think about how do we redress these historic harms? And then number two, when we think about these areas, these communities, our communities, let me say it that way, that have been labeled the front lines now. I'm from Eastern North Carolina. I always hear that Eastern North Carolina is all of a sudden the front lines of climate change. But I know that is not the only story. These communities are not destined to be impacted. They're not destined to be victims. Our communities are sources of deep models of self-determination, deep models of visioning, deep models of familial connections to land through which we've provided for ourselves, our families, and our communities. And we must constantly iterate that to the social discourse as they seek to impose the label of being an impacted community. Now, to be fair on this reality, and I'm doing this because I got to tell this story, we do see occasionally instances where a family or generation is able to break this cycle, to relocate and see a better existence. But that is often the exception and not the norm. And it is nowhere near the scale of disruption that one bad policy catalyzed. And my grandfather was a reverend, but he also He used to hustle a little pool, y'all, in his day before. So don't tell nobody. But he used to say that if you're shooting pool and someone tips the table on its back legs and asks you to take the shot, occasionally you might find someone who's able to make that shot. But the occasional shot does not mean that's how you play pool. So the occasional story of success, the occasional story of triumph, the occasional story of one family or one person escaping those realities doesn't mean that's how we should treat our communities or develop for the future. I like this quote. Van Jones in The Green Collar Economy says it like this: the green economy should not just be about reclaiming thrown away stuff. It should be about reclaiming thrown away communities. It should not just be about recycling things to give them a second life. We should also be gathering up people and giving them a second chance. In other words, we should use the transition to a better energy strategy as an opportunity to create a better economy and a better country all around. And when we think about what a just transition in the green economy offers, it gets us back to another chance to reclaim the original concept of sustainable development. We can make sure to get those three pillars right. We can make sure to get those three pillars right. And the opportunities there we see are numerous. We see opportunities through a just transition for more diverse businesses that are better for workers and communities. There's a study by Cornell University that shows counties with more small and local businesses were better in almost every social metric. Everything from health, education, lower crime rates, better children's health, more satisfaction, social satisfaction. We see the opportunity to scale climate solutions. Note that every iteration of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change carves out a critical role for community-scaled solutions. And community-scale solutions have been shown to generate larger benefits when done in conjunction with other development activities. So not only reinvesting into communities to address climate, but thinking about other social needs, hospitals, healthcare, clean air, clean water, clean food, education. As a small business owner now, I see a specific role of business in bringing about this just transition. And one of the people whose voices I'd like on this subject is Muhammad Yunus, who is the founder of Grameen Bank. And he says two quotes that speak to this moment. Business is a very beautiful mechanism to solve problems, but we never use it for that purpose. We only use it to make money. So it satisfies our selfish interests, but not our collective interests. He also says that poverty is an artificial, external imposition on a human being. It is not innate to a human being. And since it is external, it can be removed. It is just a question of doing it. And I think those two quotes offer this really exciting glimpse of opportunity and hope, right? Because just like those bad policy decisions were made over a century ago, none of us may have been at the table when they were made, but we're still eating what was on the menu. Let's change the menu. And so, to talk real quickly about some of the work that we do at Rural Beacon, this is just an example of community solutions, and I don't want this conversation to turn into a pitch. This conversation is too important. But what I hope to illustrate is that there's room for innovation. There's massive room for innovation, massive need for innovation. This crisis is of such an unprecedented scale that no particular silo of society that we may be depending on to solve it can do it on its own. Government cannot solve it on its own. Community organizing cannot solve this on its own. The faith community cannot solve this on its own. Private finance cannot solve this on its own. Industry cannot solve this on its own. So we need a new politic that awakens the power of collective awareness towards the goal of creating a better world for all of us. And so one thing that we do at Rural Beacon Initiative is we try to operate in the model of a socio-business as coined by Professor Muhammad Yunus, where he describes a socio-business as a business that is primarily designed to meet a social need, not to generate profit. Profit is a secondary or tertiary goal. And so what we are looking at is how to use integrated capital to address Black land loss and support regenerative development in Eastern North Carolina. Our model is our Free Union Farm Sustainability Hub, through which we are using a combination of green finance and a hybrid model of nature-based solutions and technology to address the climate crisis. So in doing this, we see a few things: a unique opportunity to preserve a historic site and address Black family land loss in rural Eastern North Carolina. So we are doing this in a community called Free Union. It's actually my paternal ancestral hub. It's the place where my roots originate on my father's side. Grandfather grew up here, father grew up here. I spent a lot of time in this community. This is a community that was a triracial community, and some of y'all know what that means, south of the Mason-Dixon line that existed before the Civil War. These were free people of color. Free people of color. A lot of people don't know that history existed. It's a community where a significant majority of the land is still within the hands of some of the original family members. Now, of course, they're starting to see fracture points to aging and encroaching industry, but that's why we said we want to reclaim this history. And so we developed a unique partnership that looks at finance, that looks at land access, that looks at increasing ownership diversity in regenerative food systems, as well as renewable energy, and creating triple bottom line benefits for the community. So benefits along the lines of equity, ecology, and economy. We're looking to use this as a way to show what can be done in the form of a new type of rural economic development for our communities, to change the conversation. We're not the front lines, we're the sources of innovation. And so we're seeking to drive clean investments, to provide clean food, and also increase green awareness amongst the community. And here's a little bit about our site, what we're looking to do. But I say this because this is just one example of what is possible. There are so many other solutions that people are employing. There are so many other powerful movements that are being led. So many other examples of directly impacted communities that are fighting back. This is from the community of Union Hill, Virginia. And if any of you all followed the exploits of Union Hill, Virginia, this was a community, a historic community of color. No one knew about Union Hill. No one knew anything about Union Hill. But it was cited to house the largest compressor station on the eastern seaboard during the fight of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Michael's shaking his head because he knows this story. Dominion Energy, misinterpretation, was trying to build a compressor station in this community. And they essentially, this small community of Union Hill, supported by interracial, intergenerational coalition partners, pushed back, literally a David and Goliath fight. But in pushing back, not only were they able to stop the compressor station, they were a part of stopping the entire pipeline and redefining what pipeline opposition looked like on the eastern seaboard. Some more of their work. When we think about what else other groups are doing, this is a platform, the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, that is comprised of a group of environmental and climate justice organizations and traditional green groups who are looking to redress harm, both in the present moment, but of the historic blind spots and challenges, the fracturing that has happened in the green movement, of pitting people against planet instead of holding them together. And they've come up with a platform that is an incredible vision of what could look like. Gulf South for a Green New Deal is another similar group. And I encourage you all to go and look at some of these resources. Poor People's Campaign, of course, is another group that has launched the Poor People's Jubilee platform that has robust visioning around what climate and environmental stewardship could actually mean in terms of public policy. And this work of communities has reached a critical point 40 years after the 1982 Warren County protests, where right here in North Carolina, the United States environmental justice movement was born. Now, over 40 years later, we get to the Justice 40 initiative that, though it is not a silver bullet, is absolutely a reflection of the leadership, the commitment, the efforts of communities to ensure that environmental, climate, and energy justice goes from abstract concepts to realities. And so what Justice 40 does is a step in the right direction, but it's a mandate within the federal policy departments to ensure that when we think about underserved communities, they receive a significant, estimated at 40% of all benefits coming from our transition to a clean energy economy. Now, some of the groups that I'm worked for, I'm proud to say, have put a premium on that and are looking that over 50% of all direct benefits will go to disadvantaged communities. But the conversation is shifting. The conversation is shifting. And so I will close by saying that when we think of being in this moment of immense challenge, also recognizing that we are in this moment of immense opportunity and the outcomes, what we see from this moment going forward are fully on what we decide to do collectively. And while that may, on one hand, seem daunting, it is also an incredibly exciting and inspiring moment, because I feel it shows that if we step up to the challenge, if we decide to meet this moment collectively, if we decide to prioritize just transition, to prioritize investing in disadvantaged communities, to prioritize building a better country for all of us and the generations to come, if we decide to do that, we have no choice but to win. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to call him Reverend Barber. But he is William, and thank you so much, William. We will now have questions, and if anybody on the Zoom wants to ask a question, please put it in the chat. We will try to get as many questions as possible, but we can't stay here all night. So I have a microphone. Anybody have questions? Oh, I knew you had.
I'm an old guy, so I've been around to see this. I read the first Club of Rome report back in the 1970s, and the thing that really eats at me is that so much of our data and our statistics and the way that policy is written, it works on an individual basis, not on communities. And I've done disaster work for over 40 years. And one of the things that I've seen are the remarkable results of places in Virginia, in Kansas, and other places where communities were brought together to make decisions together about how to rebuild and how to rebuild better together rather than make it an individual decision. And that's very frustrating, especially in the area of disaster work, because, you know, we have served 1,900 families who couldn't rebuild by themselves here, and we still have about 400 on the waiting list. But those are individual cases. They're being treated by the state as individual cases instead of looking at communities like Duffy Field and Harlow and other places where what you're talking about would force the policy change to deal with that as a community rather than individual households.
I'll go there. Yeah. So, absolutely. I mean, I appreciate that sentiment. And I know that wasn't a question, but, you know, my reflection on that is, I think, threefold. Is one, there's this growing movement and momentum to, I think, move away from looking at data in these individual manners to a more holistic, a more community-based manner. It's not there yet, but I do see momentum in that direction. And I see it in the form of the rebirth of conversations around just transition, the ESG goals, of course, coming out of the UN. I see many, you know, models of that. And so that awareness is happening. So I'm encouraged in that regard. Number two, I think that means that's work that we have to do. Is to continue to go out to advocate, to beat the streets in spaces where these decisions are being made, and stressing that a community-based approach instead of an individual-based approach, we really need that new type of politic and thinking. I mean, the climate crisis is unprecedented. So meaning the solutions have to be unprecedented. So that's the second, you know, way I think about it. And then third, I think the work that you are doing illustrates that there is precedent for thinking in that way. It doesn't mean we're just pulling it out of thin air. When we have wanted to think about solutions and policy in a collective, on a community-based scale, we have forced ourselves to. So in this moment, we have to force ourselves to. You know.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just moved back here from Washington, D.C., working with the federal government. I was born in Cove City there. And I had just bought my mama's house in Duffy Field. I think you have done some marvelous things that is evidenced by the fact that the EPA secretary came out of North Carolina, that you have that advocate. Number two, I am really concerned that this new highway is coming through Newbern. I cannot believe it. It's the same policy and phenomenon that you talked about. Some of my classmates from J.T. Barber live in James City. My grandmother lived there. How is it that we have this still happening? Secondly, I'm concerned about the fact that, you know, I'm a scientist, by the way. If we just had a drainage system in New Bern, we wouldn't have this flooding. So my concern is, what have we been doing? I just got back here in March, and I see all of this. I mean, how can we move forward with politicians and policymakers? I worked on the Hill, by the way, making policy. PL 94-142, Education of the Handicapped. I helped write that first law. What can we do as advocates? We have an advocate in D.C., in D.C. now. The EPA secretary came out of North Carolina because he sued Duke Power. I know the history. Are we using that to our advantage?
That's a great, you know, framing. The first thought I have is, you know, I would look to you all as the local experts on this issue, and not saying, you know, to pass that off, but saying, you know, what are the ideas and solutions you all would want to see placed? A lot of this is a function of the zoning issues, as I understand it. So I would be curious about what are the dynamics on the local at the local government level. I would also highlight there are avenues to kind of increase visibility, of some of the issues happening right here in New Bern. So making sure to stress that DEQ, the State Department of Environmental Quality, that has to look at most state permits. I don't know if you mentioned the highway, so it's highway, correct? Did I hear you right? Yeah, so that's a state permit. So there are permits. What number is it? 70? Oh, it's the extension?
Oh, it's going to become 42.
Oh, okay. So recognizing the state agency, both the Department of Environmental Quality and Department of Transportation, the Department of Environmental Quality now has the Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board. We meet quarterly. So, and I can give out the contact by which we can get this information into front, in front of some of our board's members. That helps kickstart the conversation in my mind. And also the Department of Transportation, they are now, because of Executive Order 246 that was signed recently by Governor Cooper, are mandated to have environmental justice considerations. Now, let me be real with y'all and take off my hat. I don't think that alone is going to solve the problem. But if these are words that they have committed themselves to, let's hold them accountable to them. So if they've said through executive order that we want every department, state department, to consider environmental justice concerns more robustly, well, what does that really mean when we talk about the community of Duffyfield? I don't know. I haven't been here, but would love to put you all in touch, and think about some of that.
The almighty dollar has driven our economy and ourselves forever. How do we de-emphasize that and start looking more closely at the environment and the social aspects that you're talking about?
Really excellent question, and a lot of people smarter than me are putting, emphasis behind that. But some of the things that I've seen, I mentioned these ESG goals that have really been massively adopted at the international level, but also are starting to creep up within business. So looking at the triple bottom line of equity, economy, and ecology, and actually putting numerical value, assigning value to achieving benefits along those lines. There are also exercises that are looking at the social cost of carbon, of course, putting a number on how much is lost in terms of our economy when we, by depending on a fossil fuel economy. How much is lost by public health disparities? How much is lost when we think that, before the pandemic of COVID-19, 700 Americans were dying every day from poverty, not the pandemic. So how do we put those numbers, in front of folks and into the conversation? And then third and finally, I think, when we look at the benefits, recognizing that these financial institutions, which I see as one of the levers of power we need to flip, they respond to the dollars. But adding those considerations, putting these numbers on like the social cost of carbon, the benefits that we can see through the ESG goals, it changes the calculus. So when we look at the dollars generated, it's not just a simple input output. It takes into account these considerations. It takes into account the benefits or detriments to communities, and hopefully it drives better policy considerations.
Hi, this is more of an announcement than a question, and I really appreciate your talk. So I work with the Craven College here in town, and we got some really good news recently. We're one of 12 schools, including North Carolina Central, that got a part of a grant, a state grant, to establish environmental education and vocational training. And this is going to be a big deal for this area and potential students, because you can be a high school senior and graduate, and if you've gone through this program, you're going to know how to learn how to install solar panels. It's all going to be done at the Volt Center right here downtown, which is actually very close to a lot of the disadvantaged communities. So I mentioned that as an area of opportunity and very good news for folks, students who can get these jobs, like you mentioned, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year, and also impacting our environment with this grant.
And you jogged my note to my friend's point behind you, Michael, on the drainage system. we're living in a post-Inflation Reduction Act world, which of course dedicated $369 billion to energy-friendly investments, which includes a set aside for monies at the municipal level for clean water and drainage projects that you're mentioning. And the state is supposed to receive requests for projects that meet that need. So that is something else to flag and for us to think about.
A response, my understanding is that monies get diverted, and I've just been here and people have been telling me all these things since March. Monies get diverted to other choice projects that politicians and others need. So we need some people to step up to the plate. That's all I'm saying.
I hear you. Yeah.
A quick response to what you're commenting on, that there was a grant that came just recently, was awarded to the city for drainage and sewer systems throughout Duffy Field. I don't know that we can say they'll be done to our hope and expectation, but they will be addressed. And the bigger question I have for you is, do you actually see the, I guess I'd call it the infusion of this sentiment in the educational system that's training the individuals who build, who engineer and design stormwater and water treatment, and who manage the cities of the country, to actually have an expectation as part of their job that they actually would work in this direction? Because I know it's very common in cities for individuals to think from the old mindset and not to think about swales and how to manage water differently than dropping it down a sewer system. And rather thinking forward is very unusual. Are you seeing a change in that?
So two things. We are seeing some of that sea change. A few months ago, I was actually at the Wharton School of Public Policy, of course, which is one of the leading schools in urban and rural infrastructure, sustainable development infrastructure. And they were having a full conference on exactly what we're talking about tonight. I'm also seeing it, in, as I mentioned, folks really looking back, taking a second look in response to many of us in this space, not just myself, but articulating that when we say considering those 3 E's of sustainable development, let's revisit that and get that right. It's not just about dollars and greenhouse gases. We also have to talk about communities. It's not happening as fast as it needs to be. And so the work, and it's not going to continue to happen just, passively. So it means there needs to be continued advocacy to drive academic institutions to think in that direction and to reward innovative businesses that are coming up with solutions that meet those needs. So I think that's the pincer move that's needed to really facilitate the sea change. And also you mentioned the grant. I'm not a local, so I'm outside coming in, but what I'm hearing is that it is important for some of you all in this room to get in on the first floor of that application, understand what that grant, when was it awarded, who is managing it, what are their projects, getting public comment early and often to make sure that you all position yourselves as stakeholders, educated stakeholders, in that work. So.
Robert Stoller, to answer your question about Duffy Field, it's just $250,000, and it ain't going to do nothing in Duffy Field. Yeah. You mentioned a great line here, the feedback loop of economic and political power of historical harm. And my understanding of the feedback loop.
I don't know that's what I said, but.
Okay, well,
I'll let you finish, yeah.
Okay. And that my understanding of it is caused by wealthy people writing laws to benefit wealthy people. All right. So, and that's how our political system. We're a republic. Wealthy.
That's not. I said intentionally bad, regardless of class.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
I said bad policy.
Yeah, bad policy is bad for poor people, but is good for rich people. That's the only difference between good and bad policy.
No. I fully disagree. I fully disagree. And what I will say, to be very clear, is that when you look at, unless we are embracing that, for example, you take the policy of underwriting, which was federal policy.
Yes, it
that
was
had an
federal.
explicitly segregationist component that was explicitly racially discriminatory.
Yes, it was. And it wasn't done by
That
poor
was
people.
not done to benefit anyone.
It
That was
certainly
not
did.
done to better our country. Absolutely not. Because when you
Now,
look at the current
I'll-
outcomes, no. To recognize that that discriminatory policy actually led and contributed to the fact that we are in a global climate crisis today that is threatening everyone. Because it allowed for certain communities to be seen as less than, to be seen as dumping grounds, to then be targeted for expanded fossil fuel industry. And a rampant fossil fuel industry has run rampant on our planet.
One thing that I've worried about on the coast, and really since Katrina, is about the providing for people to move away from places. And like I know during COVID, lots of people moved, more people moved out to the barrier islands, which is like one of the worst places to build. And I think like Fort Myers, and this whole idea of we're going to go in and rebuild places that are vulnerable rather than creating a movement of people and providing for relocation of people out of these dangerous areas. And then just a whole movement of people. I think the immigration issue is all tied to that too. Those countries are going to have agricultural failures and they'll need to move north. And there's just like this whole, I guess, how do you address the movement of people, which is just so huge and it's just going to happen?
You raise a really important piece that we did not cover tonight, which looks at climate fuels infused displacement. So when we see about some of the international crises happening and the massive migrations of people everywhere from the Middle East to Latin America, a lot of what is fueling that is these famines. They're having multi-year famines that are being caused by the climate crisis, where people literally are having to move homes that they've lived and known their entire lives because they cannot survive. It's not that people are just looking to necessarily leave, they are being forced to. And the spectrum of the trajectory usually happens, they're being forced from the countrysides into highly overpopulated urban areas. The urban areas collapse, and so they are now being forced to migrate from their countries. And so, you know, there's actually a report in the Lancet report that said we could see over 1 billion climate migrants in the next few years. And when we think about the impact that has on already existing social systems, we have to be thinking about this as an unprecedented crisis and be anticipating that need.
So I have a question and a comment. Going back to the back and forth between you two guys, what I heard was that there's some people understand that's what's good for us is good for me. Some people don't understand that. Some people think what's good for me is good for me, even though ultimately that turns out to be false. I was at an event a week ago on the environment at my church, First Press. We had this really good guy talk about sea level changes. And I was stunned to hear a couple of very bright, educated, compassionate people whose first response, and I don't know what their later response was, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to me? I didn't hear people saying what's going to happen to us. Mm-hmm. And so my question to you, and that's where I feel stuck right now, is how do I help people understand the need to ask what's going to happen to us?
I think it's moments like this, it's showing up, it's getting educated and using that education to go out and be, disciples to that work. I think it's also being intentional about which conversations you engage in. And to be very clear, I am forceful when it talks about that conversation around policy being done that has had disproportionate impacts being benign. The severity of harm has been too bad. It can never be benign. When we look at the displacement that is being caused right now, when we look at the displacement of communities of color that has too long gone unchallenged in mass, that can never be benign. So out the gate, I really, personally, this might be where I need some growth, I'll be honest with y'all. Those might be some conversations where you all can help engage and identify, opportunities and talking points. But I have a strong line in ever considering the harm that has been done as benign. Now, we don't have to call people evil, but we do have to hold them accountable, and we have to learn from the lessons of the past so we don't make those same mistakes in this current moment.
Hello. Yes, my question goes directly to that point. When you're talking about the intentional policies that were made to place communities of color into areas that were designed to be dumping grounds. When you think of that and you think about those places, those areas that were structured to be, that were designed by redlining, and when you consider that these communities have been systemically designed that way, I'm wondering if, for example, the community of Evanston in Illinois has recently come up with a policy to try to begin to address those problems. They're coming up with a system of some kind of reparation where the community is making structured payments to African American families. I don't know all of what they're doing, but they're doing something, okay? Mm-hmm. My question to you is, they recognize that there has been harm. They are doing something to try to address it. I don't know how well they're addressing the problem, but have you heard of any kind of programs where they are actually trying to address it? Because not only were the highways deliberately structured to destroy African American communities, not only were highways put in place to tear homes down and to tear up business districts that Black communities had that were thriving, but these communities, and it was done deliberately to destroy, African American businesses that were strong and communities that were strong. This was not by accident. None of this was by accident. Okay, so don't think that it was in any way done without understanding that they were destroying Black communities that had, that were thriving, and Black communities that were allowing families to prosper, because when they saw that Black families were prospering, they could not stand that. Understand this, people, that these communities were strong and they destroyed them because they were strong. So if you don't understand that, read the history, okay? So because of that, I want to know if you know of anything that's being done to address that, and if not, then we need to figure out ways to actually address that. As communities, that needs to be addressed. And if we're not doing it, then it needs to be done, because it was systemically destroyed. It needs to be systemically addressed.
Right. And I think that latter part of what you're saying is, where I really want to circle in. We're talking about systems, not individuals, not whether people are good people, not whether people are, individual actions. We're talking about systemic impact and systemic action. And so recognize we're thinking at a different level when we think about what is being put in place, what needs to be put in place. But to get to your point directly, I have seen some momentum of initiatives that I'm really excited about. One thing that I've seen both in the home lending space as well as the green banks that are looking at clean energy deployments is using alternatives to credit underwriting. So recognizing that communities have been historically barred from just financial access and creating credit histories. How do we make sure that they're not left out of the equation? And so looking at alternatives to credit underwriting that indicate that low and moderate income players are actually viable candidates to be considered for clean energy retrofits. Also looking at no upfront costs when we talk about clean energy improvements like rooftop solar, heat pumps, things of the like that have incredible benefits to one's social health, but also lowering those utility bills, which means immediate cash flow for these communities. Also looking at creatively structuring community scale projects that incorporate a vein of community ownership. So how do we not just see communities as nascent markets, right, customers or participants, but actually as true owners, you know, in this emerging economy? And I would also finally say that the J40 initiative, again, is a very powerful floor. It is not the ceiling of where we need to go, but coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act, there are several targeted programs that focus explicitly on meeting the needs of the communities you're talking about. Everything from fleet electrification of school buses in disadvantaged communities to clean water infrastructure, someone mentioned, and making sure we redress some of those harms, to looking at programs and projects that look at legacy pollution from greenhouse gases and limiting exposure. So there's a lot being done. It's not all going to be solved. There's a lot of work to be done. But again, and I'll end here, the only way we are able to meet this moment, the only things that can be solved are the things that we face and face fully.
Thank you again, William. This has just been a great thing and some really great questions. We're going to end right now. I just want to remind you that the Carolina Nature Coalition exists only by donations. So if you like what we're doing, like these things that we're doing now in the past and things that we're planning for the future, please give us a donation so that we can continue what we're doing. And if you signed in, I want to thank also the people that are here and the people that are online. And if you have signed in, we will get back in touch with you and show you our future presentations. We appreciate all of you, and I want to say have a good night.